So this is my 6th year here at Pecos. I started with this wild notion that the ancestral Puebloans in Chaco were doing algebra. And I had some initial evidence of that. A lot of people didn't understand what algebra was, let alone what fractal geometry was. So the last 5 years I've been trying to explain that in greater detail. After my initial excitement wore off from recovering the first information on that, and my engineering background kicked in for documentation, there were several things that came to mind. Some people would say reared its ugly head, that were going to be necessary in order to prove this argument. The first was I had good data at Chaco. There was no question about what I was finding there. But from an engineering standpoint, statistical analysis, if you're really trying to prove something, requires not only lots of data, but lots of different locations. So I knew that I was going to have to do a lot of travel, and I ended up driving all around the 4 states, 4 corners. And since I financed my own research, I have to say at this point it reminds me of an old bluegrass song, I ain't completely broke, but I am badly bent. Secondly, I needed to develop a model of some sort that was going to allow me to easily identify fractal architecture from existing floor plans that had been done for the great houses, not only in Chaco, but in the other outliers as well. For instance, Kettle is not fractal, even though it has a curved wall, but its neighbor, Pueblo Bonito, is probably the largest fractal architecture in the world. Thirdly, the presence of these algebraic computations necessarily required some kind of instrumentation capable of doing square root calculations. You can't do fractals without square roots. So it was going to be necessary to argue both the presence and the ability of known calculation instruments during the period of time of Chaco that could produce results that had the same error budget that we were finding in the measurements of the great houses themselves. Fourth, engineering ideas like these being presented to an archaeological community can make you into a majority of one in a hurry. So it seemed important to me that some kind of independent research, completely aside from my own, needed to happen that would somehow correlate and corroborate what I had found. And finally, whatever it was that happened in the early 9th century, the experience lifted that culture out of a existence in pit houses and up and into some of the largest architecture on the planet at the time it was built. So outside of an archaeological context, it seemed important to me to try and figure out, was it local that they figured this out? Did they inherit it somehow? Where did this math come from? How did it develop? And it was clear to me that if I was going to effectively argue this, I had to come up with answers to all of these items before I could walk away from it in good conscience. So over the next 5 years, I began to gather and document the evidence. Time and again, as I looked at the outliers in the 4 southwestern states, I came across the same algebraic fractal architecture again and again. In fact, I came across it so many times at one point I had to put out a 2nd edition of my book to include all of the information that was involved there. Because the more I looked, the more I found. And I think there's still more to be identified yet. My digital computer worked like a charm in terms of creating a model that I could easily identify things with. And starting with Zinklitzen on the South Mesa above Chaco, and concluding years later with sites at Quetzal and Hovenweep, Aztec North, Chaco East Community, and so forth, fractal architectures slowly began to emerge in a realization that probably had occurred for the first time in 1,000 years. Thirdly, the collection of instruments necessary for the calculations also began slowly to look like a toolbox. The tough one was the square root calculator, but thanks to a great guy named Ben Mixon, who's unfortunately no longer with us, and Dr. Todd Bostwick, we were able to finally identify the likely prehistoric instrument that was capable of doing the square root calculations. And it was pretty amazing. I built a model of it, and it was its precision was pretty much on the order of a slide rule. The last two items of the correlation of independent research and likely origins were pretty elusive until just this last winter. Interestingly enough, they showed up in the same package. And I'm happy to announce today some of that independent correlation. Some of you may be aware of an outfit in Texas called the Maya Exploration Center, which is headed up by Dr. Edward Barnhart. Barnhart, who studied under Sheehy and a number of other people, is pretty much the go-to guy in this day and age for information on Maya. His colleague there is a guy named Dr. Christopher Powell. Powell is not only an archaeologist, but he is an expert in prehistoric mathematics, particularly what they call ethnomathematics, which is the type of mathematics that is performed by cultures without a written language. And of course, Chaco falls right into this. And what luck, Powell has found and documented, and I have the document here, the same fee-based fractal architecture at a number of sites in Maya that I found in Chaco and the other outliers. Importantly, he has found them at several sites, but two of them particularly are important is Palenque and Chichen Itza. And the reason these sites are important is because they overlap the Chaco experience, same period of time. And both the presence of macaw feathers and chocolate in Chaco that are from that area of the Yucatan strongly suggests they were trading partners. It would not be surprising, I think, to suggest that there's some likelihood that the basis of the mathematics that Chaco was using probably grew out of the Mayan experience. The big difference was the Mayan were doing what they call rectilinear fee-based architecture, which is to say the fractals were rectangles. Chaco took that and essentially turned it into curvilinear fractals, which, like the shape of Pueblo Bonito and Zinclitzen and so forth, is a curved plaza wall or a curved room block. And this is kind of like going from bicycles to airplanes. This is not a small step. And the statistical analysis, fortunately, has pretty much proven this out. You know, most archaeologists, I think, are happy if they get 2 or 3 sigma on a statistical analysis. What we're getting in the statistical analysis so far beyond 6 sigma, they don't have a sigma name for it. So that pretty much checked off the last 2 items for me. And I'm pleased to be able to share that with you today. Now the big question, of course, is why is this important? And I think there are several reasons, not the least of which is, you know, today Native Americans as a community and a culture are dealing, like we are in our combined communities, with the issues of drugs, alcohol, poverty, racism, and enforced intellectual delinquency. Many young people in the Native American communities are trying to rise above this. Unfortunately, there are organizations out there that are trying to help them in terms of success occupationally in engineering and manufacturing and technology. And they're trying to get beyond these issues, but Native Americans carry an additional stigma that the rest of us don't carry. And this, I have to say, pathetically backward notion that their ancestors were a bunch of ignorant savants that may have been pretty good at piling rocks in interesting shapes, but had no science and in fact were incapable of it, is really anathema to what's going on here. This lost knowledge that I'm describing of an ancestral participation at the dawn of prehistoric science in the Southwest, a science that we now know spans an enormous period of time from Maya to Chaco, this need not be part of the cost of an education. Rather, it ought to be the wings beneath their feet. An evolutionary understanding of the way things worked was so important to the ancestral Pueblans, they were willing to move millions of pounds of lumber and sandstone in order to create geometric shaped great houses that have stood in the desert as a metaphor for their worldview for over 1,000 years. One of the questions I keep asking is, what else did they know? Our experience with fractal geometry is only maybe 3 or 4 decades old. And they were doing this 1,000 years ago. I think there's a lot more to be discovered here, but as of today, I'm happy to say what was lost is found, and recognition delayed is recognition denied. So let's give some credit to where it's due. Thank you.